It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and this is a quick review of the ViewSonic OMNI VX2728J-2K. As usual for a video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what the monitor would look like in person. There's a longer video review and also a nice detailed written review, and you can find a link to those in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support. This monitor uses the popular combination of IPS panel 27 inches and 2560x1440, that's 1440p QHD resolution, plus a 165Hz refresh rate, technically overclocks to 180Hz, I'll get onto that a little bit later. For those interested, this one actually uses a BOE IPS ADS panel. So 27 inches, 1440p resolution, good amount of desktop real estate if you're on the desktop, decent for multitasking, or you can just have a single window if you prefer. Good level of text clarity as well. No particular issues with this one in terms of weird subpixels or anything like that going on. Good neutral sharpness as well, and you can adjust the sharpness if you wish. And there's a decent amount of clarity and detail for suitably high resolution image content, which would include gaming as well. Jumping into some Shadow of the Tomb Raider now, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. So I measured around 1000:1, very close to 1000:1, using my test settings, which has some adjustments to the colour channel, so that does drop the contrast a little bit. The maximum contrast I recorded was 1127:1, so this isn't as strong as some IPS models, but there are certainly some weaker ones out there as well. This is quite close to the specified 1000:1, pretty typical performance. The same goes for the IPS glow, it's something you have to consider. My unit also does have a moderate amount of backlight bleed, and you can see some of that. It's not just IPS glow, you can see on this scene here, you can also see some of the backlight bleed, kind of spotlighting effect in places. But the IPS glow is there even if you happen to have a unit without this kind of level of backlight bleed. Now this isn't an extreme amount of backlight bleed, by the way, it's just a little bit more than you'd ideally have. But it does bring the IPS glow out a little bit more strongly. If you're using a higher brightness on the monitor, or if you're sitting closer to the monitor, it will do the same thing. So really the IPS glow, just considering that in isolation, it's at a fairly standard level for a 27-inch IPS model. It's generally observed as a sort of cool silverish haze towards the corners of the screen, more so the bottom corners from your usual ergonomically correct viewing position, and that does just lighten things up a bit, eats away at the depth and atmosphere. The strength of IPS models like this is the strong gamma consistency. So on TN and VA models you get shifts at different points of the screen, and you can notice this when you're looking at darker shades. So with VAs you get black crush centrally, which makes things too masked, and towards the peripheral regions of the screen things can look too unmasked, it's excessive detail. TNs basically have a vertical gradient from top to bottom of the screen where detail levels for dark shades shift, and it looks really odd if it's something you notice. Whereas this model is really nice and consistent in that respect. Yes, detail is lost because of the IPS glow, but overall consistency is good. I also like to show things just with the room lightened up a bit. It's not pitch black anymore. It's a bit of daylight, not super bright, but sort of a moderate level of brightness really. And you can see that the IPS glow, the issues I was talking about before, they're much less apparent than when sitting in a dark room. In terms of the screen surface, it's what I would classify as medium or relatively light matte anti-glare. So it has stronger glare handling than many competing IPS models. They tend to have light or light to very light matte anti-glare screen surfaces. And what this means is stronger glare handling is more likely to diffuse the glare quite heavily, which means you're not likely to get sharp glare patches or reflections when you're using the monitor normally. And there is bright direct light striking the screen surface there. You can't see a sharp glare patch as you can on some of my reviews with the lighter matte screen surfaces. But because light's being diffused more strongly, it does mean it can give a hazing or a sort of washing out of the image if you have strong lighting in your room, and particularly strong direct light striking the screen surface. So you do still have to be conscious of your lighting environment. So with the screen switched on and observing the screen surface, when you're looking at brighter shades, you can notice just a little bit of light misty graininess, actually a lot less of this than you'd typically see on what I would classify as medium or relatively light matte anti-glare screen surfaces, so that was quite good. There's not a huge amount of layering either, there's not sort of a smeary look to things, just generally not as aware of the screen surface as you can be with some medium matte anti-glare screen surfaces. I'm on Battlefield 2042 and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor. So on games like this, and just using the monitor more generally if you're browsing the internet, looking at movies, that kind of thing, They're designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, and if you're using a gamut on the monitor which extends beyond sRGB, then you get extra vibrancy and extra saturation. This monitor's colour gamut, as you can see here, extends quite a bit beyond sRGB. It actually runs closer to DCI-P3. I measured 95% of the DCI-P3 colour space, so there is a lot of extra vibrancy and saturation for this kind of standard content. Remember, I'm running the monitor in SDR at the moment, so looking at the gamut in a bit more detail, you can see more specifically that it does pinch towards the red region for pure reds, and for the red to blue edge it's really closer to sRGB than DCI-P3, but elsewhere it extends more and it's closer to DCI-P3. So what this means is that things do have a good amount of extra vibrancy, saturation. There's a good vibrant look to the fires there, the grass as well, but some of the yellowish greens are brought out a bit too strongly. Generally greens look a little bit brighter than they should. Sky blues as well have a bit of extra pop to them, but it doesn't have the kind of strong extra saturation that some wide gamut models have, and because it isn't too extreme in the red region, you don't get a strong red push to earthy browns either. There's a bit of that going on, and also to skin tones. They don't look sunburnt or anything like that. So this is a look which some people are going to really like, other people not so much, and sometimes people like to use sRGB emulation to clamp things down to sRGB. This monitor doesn't actually have an sRGB emulation mode, but if you look at the colour reproduction section of the written review, I do talk about some alternatives you can use at the GPU level if that's the kind of thing you want to do. It's also worth saying that this monitor has very good colour consistency, so it is able to maintain its depth and saturation to shades very well throughout the screen, so not just for the central region of the monitor, but also peripherally. If you're using this monitor for colour critical work, that is a nice attribute to have, certainly. And also the colour gamut, 95% DCI-P3, full sRGB coverage, gives you good flexibility there, but you really do have to calibrate the monitor to get the most out of it. I would say that with any monitor really, but with this one, remember, you don't have an sRGB emulation mode, so if you're going to be working within the sRGB colour space, definitely want to be calibrating it. And for DCI-P3 work, calibration is also beneficial. Just be aware that you don't have full DCI-P3 coverage, but 95% DCI-P3 coverage is pretty decent. If you want to do work within the Adobe RGB colour space, as I mentioned in the written review, the coverage there isn't particularly good. You're looking at 87% Adobe RGB coverage, so quite a bit of under coverage of that colour space. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'm running the game in HDR. This monitor only has a very basic HDR performance. I'm using an RTX 3090 hooked up by DisplayPort at the moment, just for reference, but I tested various different inputs and GPUs, and you can see more about that in the written review. The activation of HDR on this monitor is also a bit awkward. I'm just going to mention that quickly. And there's a setting called HDR in the setup menu section of the OSD, which needs to be enabled. Don't know if you can see that. I know I've tried to adjust the camera, but the menu's pretty bright and it's not picking up on that too well. But there is a little setting, HDR, you have to have that set to on. Problem is that if you leave that set to on and then you've got an SDR signal, you lose a lot of your usual controls, so you can't adjust a lot of things. If you only use a set of settings for SDR and you're happy with that, then that's okay, because it will remember the settings that you selected before selecting HDR on. This is for SDR, remember. When you're actually running HDR, so that means you've got an HDR signal, then the monitor switches to its HDR mode if you've got HDR set to on, and will just do its thing. There's really very little you can configure. So I'm not sure if you can see exactly what was greyed out there, but basically everything, you can't adjust the brightness, the usual restrictions apply really, you can't really adjust anything, so it's just one experience that you get for HDR. There are some advantages to HDR in terms of 10-bit colour reproduction. I talk a little bit more about that in the full video review and also the written review, but basically it enhances your nuanced shade variety, so it does give a different look to things, and you can see perhaps a better variety of dark shades. But the issue here is that this monitor doesn't have any local dimming at all. It just has the backlight set at a similar level as it would be at maximum and at SDR. So the whole backlight is basically at a level which will give 270 nits for white, and that means that the level of these dark shades is really raised far above what it should be. It does not look deep and atmospheric at all. And then you consider the brighter shades. They're not particularly impressive by HDR standards at all. 270 nits is really not good by HDR standards. So the whole thing just looks quite flat in that respect, and there's nothing high dynamic range about what's being shown in that respect. But again, remember that 10-bit colour reproduction, it is helpful, and it can also smooth out gradients for brighter shades as well. So I'm just going to dive into the water here. It kind of makes the weather effects look a bit nicer, smoother progressions, but again, 270 nits maximum. It really just sort of cuts off your brightest shades. You just don't see them, you don't appreciate them. The glint of light on the water surface there is not impressively bright at all. It looks quite sort of dull actually by HDR standards. So yeah, very basic experience. In terms of colour reproduction, the monitor is able to use its colour gamut better under HDR because the developers are able to target DCI-P3 or ultimately Rec 2020 massive colour gamut, which this monitor certainly does not fully cover. But I look at these green shades here and they look fairly lush, fairly vibrant. It doesn't look quite as vibrant actually as I'd expect even from the colour gamut. It could be partly because of the fact that it has such bad luminance precision, it doesn't have any local dimming, and that can help add a bit of extra depth to some of these lush shades as well. So things don't really look as lush and vibrant as they could even with the colour gamut that's being used here. I wouldn't describe them as looking washed out in that respect either. And also it does tone some of the things down. So Lara's skin looks a little bit overdone under SDR, and these rocks as well have this sort of coppery quality that they shouldn't really have under SDR, which is just overdone. There's too much of a red tint or reddish orange tint. So that is toned down suitably under HDR. With the lack of local dimming and the fact the colour gamut's not massive, there's nothing incredible in terms of vibrancy going on here. Just a very basic HDR experience. It does give a different look to things, so it can be nice to use it from time to time. And just to quickly reinforce how poor the dark shades are, that scene I was showing you before when I was talking about contrast, exactly the same scene, the only difference is I've got HDR rather than running my test settings. So remember, my test settings does not have the screen at full brightness. The camera isn't adjusted in the same way, so it's not really a fair comparison. Perhaps be a bit more like that. But even so, you can see things do not look deep or atmospheric at all. I'm on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. So this monitor, at base, it has a 165Hz maximum refresh rate. There is an overclocking feature, and that's in the setup menu, overclocking. You just set that to on, and then what will happen is it will list a 180Hz refresh rate as well. I won't activate this or show you this because there's nothing really you can see that will be different in the video, but it really makes a negligible difference compared to 165Hz. I do cover it a bit more in the written review if you're interested, but it also locks off adaptive sync, so you can't use VRR at the same time. That's the only restriction I noticed. It didn't seem to lock anything else off. You could use HDR at the same time as well. You just can't use VRR. So for most people, they are going to want to use VRR, variable refresh rate, adaptive sync on this monitor. So stick to the overclocking off. And as I said, negligible difference between that and 165. But there's certainly a big difference between 165Hz at a good high frame rate and 60Hz. The 60 FPS experience, very big difference there. This high frame rate, high refresh rate combination brings you two main advantages. It improves the connected feel, which describes the fluidity, precision you feel when you're interacting with the game. This monitor also has an exceptionally low signal delay, has low input lag. I measured a bit under 2 milliseconds, so that doesn't impede the experience. It's really good in that respect, nice responsive feel. The other advantage of this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it reduces perceived blur due to eye movement. If you're not familiar with the term perceived blur, there is an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness which covers this in detail. There's also a bit of a summary in the responsiveness section of the written review, so do check that out if you're not familiar. Also talk about pursuit photography, a nice technique where you can show the effect of the refresh rate on perceived blur. Also shows the impact of pixel responses, which is the other aspect of perceived blur that you have to consider. So here you can see some pursuit photographs taken from this monitor using various different response time settings, standard, advanced and ultra fast at 165Hz. There are examples at various other refresh rates in the written review, including 180Hz overclock, but that, as I said, looks very similar to 165Hz really. I've also got a reference screen here, the Gigabyte M27Q running at 170Hz, negligible difference between that and 165Hz. And the reason I use that as a reference is because that's at a level which most people are very comfortable with. It's not the fastest IPS model out there, but it performs at a level which is decent, so if a monitor can at least match that, then that's a good start. Now this monitor, using its standard setting, it's quite similar, actually slightly faster than the Gigabyte if you look closely at the trailing behind the UFOs. But the advanced setting does offer some improvement, particularly for the medium background and the light background. And the weaknesses are quite minor in terms of trailing, so there's an improvement over the reference screen and also over the standard mode here using advanced, so that's nice to see. Good performance really, not a huge amount of what I'd call powdery trailing. Most of it is for the dark background, but even that's not a sort of extended smeary trailing or a heavy powdery trailing, and it isn't as bold as seen on the M27Q. For example, if you look behind the red UFO body and look at the trailing just behind it there, it does look bolder on the M27Q. In the ultra fast setting, it does cut down on this powdery trailing, but it replaces it with obnoxious inky looking overshoot. or bright overshoot, depending on where you're looking. And in practice, considering a broader range of pixel transitions, it really just reflects what I showed you with Test UFO, and also it does reflect a somewhat superior performance to the Gigabyte M27Q. The weaknesses, the main weaknesses, occur where there are bright or heavily saturated shades against a darker background. This nice little white blob there, or E to pick up a letter writing. That shows it a bit. You're not really going to be able to see this clearly in the video though, because it's not an obvious weakness. It isn't anything like the smeary trading you get on VA models. It isn't like the kind of heavy powdery trading you get on some IPS models either. And also where there are dark shades with lighter backgrounds, you can see it a little bit. So really just minor weaknesses, a little bit of powdery trailing, but a strong performance overall, which most people are going to be very happy with indeed. And there isn't anything that is of great concern in the way of overshoot either, just a little trace here and there for some transitions, nothing that jumps out, nothing that's obvious, nothing that most people are going to notice, even if they're actively looking for it. The monitor supports VRR with adaptive syncs. You can use AMD FreeSync with AMD GPUs and compatible games consoles, and you can use NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode with an NVIDIA GPU. That's what I'm using at the moment. I've got an RTX 3090 plugged in. You can expect a similar experience on the AMD and NVIDIA side. The game running at 120 frames a second, and the monitor is now matching that, 120 Hz. That's what VRR does. Aims to get rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. The VRR range of this one is between 48 and 165 Hz. That's what's claimed anyway. In my experience, it's more like 55 Hz as the floor of operation, but below this it uses LFC, low frame rate compensation, so it will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate, and that also gets rid of tearing and stuttering. Something to be aware of: as the refresh rate decreases, there is an increasing level of overshoot, so I'm using my advanced settings still, and I'm at 120 Hz like I said, and here there's a little bit of an increase of overshoot, but actually even here it's pretty good. It's nothing that I describe as strong overshoot, nothing that really jumps out, and I have tested with other scenes as well, not just this one. And remember that if you're using a games console, you're going to have a maximum of 120 Hz. So this is the kind of experience you can expect, nice solid experience. And actually the powdery trailing, as I was talking about before, it's actually reduced a little bit because the pixel response requirements for a good performance are decreased now. I've now got the game running at 60 frames a second, the monitor's running at 60 Hz, so sort of a significant drop now. And the overshoot is more noticeable, a bit more eye-catching, but it's not extreme overshoot. Some people will actually be happy to just use the advanced setting regardless of what your refresh rate is doing. So you can consider this a single overdrive mode experience if that applies to you. But you can use the standard setting if you do find it annoying. So there we go, I've just switched over to standard, and that does get rid of the overshoot. It doesn't slow down the pixel responses, so they're super sluggish either or anything like that. It's still decent. And I would refer to the written review and the pursuit photographs there if you want a little bit of a nice visual demonstration of this, because you can't really see it in the video. So it's just a slight increase of powdery trailing now, but it's not an extreme amount. So if you're spending a lot of time down here, sort of, let's say, near 60 Hz, then you might want to use the standard setting, particularly if you're sensitive to overshoot. Otherwise, just stick to advanced, and you might just find the advanced setting fine anyway. Just a few final things to go through for this section. You can use HDR at the same time as adaptive sync, that's not a problem on this model. The monitor also has a setting called MPRT, which uses a strobe backlight, and that can be used at 100 Hz and above. It is not a very good strobe backlight setting. I explore it in the written review. I'm not going to talk about it anymore here. It's not something which most people are going to want to use, even if you usually like strobe backlight settings. It's not a very good implementation. It's not well tuned. So overall, I think this is a nice monitor. I think it's a good offering for the price. It isn't something which is available in all regions, but based on US pricing, it's available there. Well, the street price, so to speak, is around $250, but I often see it close to $225. Either way, though, even for $250, I think you get a lot of monitor for your money. Just a solid all-round performance, really. Good level of responsiveness. The contrast is decent for the panel type. Not amazing, but not terrible either. Good vibrant color output. It would have been nice to have an sRGB emulation mode, so that is something that's missing. The maximum brightness isn't super high, but it's actually not terrible either, and I recorded 293 nits maximum, just a little bit shy of 300 nits, so that actually exceeds the specified 250. This is actually plenty for most people. Most people, when they're using their monitor for regular use, they'll be setting it somewhere between 100 and 200 nits. That's the usual preference. I know some people like either side of this, but this monitor still hits that and has a bit of headroom beyond that. The HDR on the monitor certainly isn't anything to write home about, but then for any monitor of this price, I'd say exactly the same thing. If you're after a 27-inch QHD monitor for this kind of refresh rate, I think this is a really good option. If you're willing to spend a bit more, then you could consider something like the MSI Mag274 QRF QD. That's quite a special monitor because of the backlight it uses. It has a quantum dot backlight, which has a really generous color gamut, so it's super vibrant if you want it to be. It also has various different emulation modes for different color spaces. So it's actually quite good if you do color critical work which needs Adobe RGB coverage as well as using it for gaming, etc. because you've got full Adobe RGB coverage and emulation of that color space, which is pretty good, and you've got full DCI-P3 or nearly full DCI-P3 coverage, and actually extends beyond those gamuts as well, so it's super vibrant if you like that kind of thing. And it's just a generally good all-round performer as well, but it does cost significantly more than this ViewSonic. So yes, this ViewSonic is certainly one I can recommend. So that's really all there is to this quick review of the ViewSonic OMNI VX2728J-2K. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, as well as a link to the full video review and information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.